Ignition sequence start. 3, 2, 1.
Range is hot. Lock and load. It's time for the Gun Rack with your hosts, Joey and Drew.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Gun Rack, Sonoran Desert Institute School of Firearms Technology's official podcast. I'm Drew Poplin with you here today. We're going to be doing a part 2 to last week's episode, just kind of finishing up talking about the Saratoga Campaign. Excited to get into that. I don't know about anyone else. I've been feeling so exhausted lately. I don't know if it's allergies going on, but my eyes just feel so dry, like I can hardly keep them open. Anyone else out there feeling like that, let me know. Before we get into finishing up the Saratoga campaign, let's talk about SDI. SDI, Sonoran Desert Institute, is an online school that helps students learn the skills and techniques that they'll need to be successful in the firearms and unmanned technology industries. SDI is accredited by the Distance Education Accrediting Commission, the DEAC, and currently we offer 3 programs in firearms technology. First of which is the Associate of Science in Firearms Technology. The second is the Certificate in Firearms Technology Gunsmithing. And finally, but certainly not least, we have the Certificate in Firearms Technology Handgun Specialist Program. Now, if you want more information about any of those, please head to our website. It's www.sdi.edu, and you can find out more. Now, for our sources, it's still going to be the same sources for the most part. Still looked at American Battlefield Trust, still consulted the History Rebels video. I mentioned it last week, but also Richard Ketchum's book, Saratoga, Turning Point of America's Revolutionary War. And there is another book that I'll be consulting for this week, one by Hoffman Nickerson called The Turning Point of the Revolution. Gee, do you think this campaign was important or something? I don't know. On another note, I feel like there have been a trillion something Revolutionary War battles that end up getting labeled as the turning point of the American Revolution. I guess that's bound to happen with, a lot of major wars. Still, it I don't know. I think I'm tripping. It's just a little pet peeve of mine. I think we all want, these things we talk about to feel of utmost importance, and it certainly is very important. I'm not disputing that, but not every single battle or campaign can be labeled the turning point of the revolution. I don't know. Maybe I've been guilty of that in the past. Just something I've been noticing. But yeah, those 2 books, both Ketchum and Nickerson's books, were very helpful. I think Nickerson wrote his originally in 1928. Yeah, I think it was 1928 that he originally wrote it. And then, of course, it got republished later on down the line. So anyway, let's continue. Where did we leave off? So just a quick recap. General John Burgoyne of the British, he proposed and started enacting a 3-pronged attack on Albany, New York. After taking a couple of forts, including Fort Ticonderoga, Burgoyne received news in late August of 1777 that his 3-pronged attack is actually only going to be a 1-pronged attack. After learning that one, General William Howe decided, I'm going to go after Philadelphia instead. And 2, his western prong, so it turned into a 2-prong before it even really began. And his second prong, which was led by Barry St. Ledger, they were making their way down the Mohawk River, going from west to east. They had to retreat after unsuccessful siege of Fort Stanwix. Now, on the Patriot side, after losing Fort Ticonderoga, General Philip Schuyler was in the process of being replaced by General Horatio Gates. As news spread about some of the battles and some of the, we'll call it extracurricular activity that was going on, that inspired more people to show up and enlist as militiamen. They arrived, and it ended up bolstering the numbers for the Continentals. Among these reinforcements, is a team of sharpshooters led by Daniel Morgan. Now, if you want to know more about Daniel Morgan, check out our Southern Battle series, in particular the Battle of Cowpens episode, as he plays a huge role in this Southern campaign. Cool dude. Anyway, so we're here September 1777, and soon Horatio Gates orders his men to move north towards Stillwater, New York. Accompanying them was a knowledgeable Polish engineer, one Colonel Thaddeus. I do not... I talked about how bad my French pronunciations are. My Polish might be worse. So I am so sorry to this dude and his family and to the entirety of Poland for this. But I'm going to give it my best shot. It's Thaddeus Kościuszko? Thaddeus Kościuszko. That was my best shot. I'm so sorry. But what's important is that this guy was very fascinating in his own right. He would be known as a war hero in Poland, America, I want to say Belarus as well. But fun fact about him, during the Revolutionary War, the only wound he received during the entire thing was a bayonet in the butt. Which, as far as injuries go, that's got to be one that's not very pleasant. I can't think of many ways to make my day worse that would be worse than getting a bayonet to the butt. But anyway, I'm going to call him Thaddeus. As the engineer, he explained that the area he had chosen wouldn't make a good area for defense. And Horatio Gates actually trusted the colonel on this, so the army would move northward, roughly 3 miles, and they would settle in at a place called Bemis Heights. Now, Horatio Gates, he set up his lines with Benedict Arnold on the left and Benjamin Lincoln on his right. However, he had just sent Benjamin Lincoln on a diversion mission at Fort Ticonderoga, meaning that he would take control of the right. Now, it was during this time that the relationship between Gates and Arnold would start to worsen, but we'll talk about that later on. Now, back with the Brits, John Burgoyne and his 7,000-strong army on the east of the Hudson now face a decision. With winter approaching, he could either take his army back to Fort Ticonderoga and wait it out in the, quotation marks here, impregnable forts, or he could continue to Albany and hope to capture it before the winter. Facing those two options, he decided to choose the latter. And I believe this was partially due to the involvement of General Sir Henry Clinton into the campaign. Now, as I mentioned in the last episode, when William Howe decided he was going to take Philadelphia, when he left, he placed Henry Clinton in charge of the defense of New York City and told him to assist Burgoyne if he could. So Clinton wrote to Burgoyne basically saying, hey, so I'm going up to Fort Montgomery. If you could use the help of me and my 2,000 men, let me know. So, of course, Burgoyne, after, receiving the bad news about St. Leger and of Howe, he was relieved to find out he'd actually be getting some help. So, of course, Burgoyne was grateful and immediately wrote back to him asking for guidance on whether he'd be able to push towards Albany or not. And if he didn't hear from him by October 12th, that he would have to retreat. This is important. We'll talk about this later. In the meantime, the Brits under Burgoyne started moving south, and on September 18th, 1777, they ended up about 4 miles north of the Continental's defensive line. At this point, Burgoyne felt that the left side of the Americans' defense was a weak point, and he reckoned that they could flank it. Benedict Arnold, whose responsibility was the left flank, also felt this to be the case. So on September 19th, as Burgoyne sent men towards the left line, Benedict Arnold would request Gates that he be allowed to move towards the nearby Freeman's Farm to kind of anticipate this attack. Now, Gates was expecting a frontal assault. He was kind of preparing for that, so he denied Arnold's request, but he did allow Daniel Morgan to take some of his sharpshooters and light infantry as recon. Of course, this recon team came into contact with Burgoyne's right, and this resulted in the Battle of Freeman's Farm. Now, by the end of this battle, the British would take Freeman's Farm. They would take the position. but at a significant cost. Daniel Morgan's sharpshooters caused 600 casualties, which was about a tenth of what Burgoyne's total force was. Not a bad day at the office for the Continentals, but again, it's Daniel Morgan we're talking about, so that's probably just another Tuesday for that guy. But little did anyone know there was another battle that was about to happen that same day. See, that morning, Benjamin Lincoln, who was sent on that diversionary mission to Fort Ticonderoga, he actually decided to lead an ambitious assault on the fort. Basically, he was able to catch up the British by surprise. And while he was ultimately unsuccessful in recapturing the fort, and that was mainly due to they lacked artillery, they were able to take some of the cannons, but didn't really have enough artillery to really follow through on the job. So while they weren't able to take the fort, they did rescue about 100 Americans and then captured about 300 British. So pretty good work, Lincoln. Nice job. Now, considering that Benedict Arnold was ultimately right about Burgoyne attacking the American left flank, you think that Horatio Gates would give him his props, right? Well, you would be wrong. Instead, Horatio Gates neglected to mention Arnold at all in his field report. And not just that, he ended up taking Daniel Morgan's men, who were independent but operated under Arnold's command at the time, under his own command. So obviously Arnold was pretty livid, and apparently the two of them had a lively conversation inside of Gates's quarters. The result of this, Gates ended up informing Benedict Arnold that he would be replaced by Benjamin Lincoln as his second in command. Arnold then wrote a letter to Gates listing all of his grievances out, and he asked to be transferred to George Washington's command. Gates pretty much said, "Go if you want. I ain't going to stop you." Gates had actually already wrote to Benjamin Lincoln asking him to return immediately, a letter that was sent out the day of the Battle of Freeman's Farm. Lincoln himself would arrive back September 22nd, but his men didn't arrive until about a week later. Now, you may be asking yourself, wait, but I thought Benedict Arnold was involved with the battle. Well, it turned out he didn't leave. And it's speculated that the only reason that Benedict Arnold didn't leave was because all the other officers, besides Gates and Lincoln, they created a petition convincing him to stay. Now, there's no physical proof of this petition, but I wouldn't be surprised if it existed, even if it's not in a document form, even if it was more of a verbal petition. Now, meanwhile, Sir Henry Clinton from New York, he was making his way up north. A day after receiving Burgoyne's letter, he captured Forts Clinton and Montgomery, and so he sent 3 messengers to inform Burgoyne of his movements, and he continued to cause damage along the Hudson River. Now, unfortunately, Burgoyne didn't know any of this, as none of the messages ended up making it to him. We don't know what would have happened if these communications had been received. How would have this affected ultimately the entire campaign? But it certainly would have leaned more towards it being in the British favor. However, since this wasn't the case, Burgoyne's men were placed on low rations, and on October 3rd, about 9 days before Burgoyne said he would need to retreat, Burgoyne decided that they would send 1,500 men to recon the Patriots' left again, because he still believed that was the weakness. And so they would do this on October 7th, 1777. By then, the Americans had around 1,500 men ready to fight, which is a huge force, especially considering the numbers that we were dealing with later in the war in the South. But despite their feelings toward each other, Benedict Arnold was still placed in command of the left flank. After the Americans spotted the Brits' movements, Gates did something similar to what he did at Freeman's Farm, and he sent Daniel Morgan and his sharpshooters, basically thinking it's going to be a repeat. And while betting on Daniel Morgan is rarely the wrong decision one can make, Benedict Arnold again begged Gates to allow him to attack with Morgan because he felt that's not enough men. And once again, Arnold was denied. However, after Benjamin Lincoln suggested something similar, then Gates allowed Enoch Poole's brigade to attempt an attack. So with that, the Battle of Bemis Heights and the last major engagement of the Saratoga Campaign was now underway. Now, the initial attack was proving to be successful, and as General Fraser, I feel like they want me to say Fraser, but spelled more like Fraser. Maybe if I say it with a British accent. General Fraser, that'll work. General Fraser, who was British, tried to call his men to withdraw from the field, but he was shot and mortally wounded. Seeing this, Burgoyne ordered everyone to retreat to behind fortified lines. And that's about the time that Benedict Arnold straight up lost it. Now, I can like conjure images in my head of him pacing back and forth at headquarters like he's Yosemite Sam or something, like swearing under his breath, just being so angry that he wasn't allowed to fight. But then he thinks to himself, wait a second. What if I rode in and attacked anyway? And that's exactly what he does. He rides in and he hits the British hard. Now, back near Freeman's Farm, which is where the heart of this battle is occurring, the British have two redoubts. Redoubts, they're basically mini forts, normally produced by like using the earth, digging and, patting the soil down. But one of these redoubts was portrayed by Heinrich Bremen and some Brunswickers, while the other was under Lord Balcarres's light infantry. Fun fact time. It's these little facts I like sprinkling in just because I think it's interesting. Lord Balcarres was Scottish, and after the war, he would go on to serve as governor of Jamaica. It's a cool little tidbit. Anyway, Arnold rides in, guns ablazing into the fray, and he immediately attempts to rally men to attack Balcarres's redoubt. This would fail, but Arnold, undeterred, and maybe, honestly, it's speculated that he might have been just trying to go full kamikaze and die in battle, like he had sort of a Lieutenant Dan mindset. Arnold charged in between the two redoubts. As you can imagine, this was quite the dangerous position for one to be in, but apparently this inspired the other Continentals to join in with him, and so they all rushed into this gap, and they went around in a circle and attacked an open area of Heinrich Bremen's redoubt. So as the sun was setting, the battle was starting to draw to a close. Arnold gets taken out of the fight. Some sources say he fell off his horse, or his horse got shot. He fell off the horse, broke his leg when the horse pinned him down. Other sources say that he got shot in the leg. Whatever the case, he hurt his leg and he was out of the fight. But before the fighting stopped, the Americans ended up taking the redoubt and had only lost 150 men compared to the Brits' 900 killed, wounded, and or captured. That's a pretty big discrepancy in terms of casualties between the two sides. So that was good news for the Americans, and the Battle of Bemis Heights was a resounding success for the Continentals, but things weren't quite over yet. Now, after the battle, John Burgoyne commanded his men to fall back to modern-day Schuylerville, New York, and this was a process that took them about 2 days, and this was due to rain and the constant probing by the Americans. Now, things weren't going amazing for the Americans, as Horatio Gates now was without his two top field commanders. Both Benjamin Lincoln and Arnold were injured in the battles, and they were starting to face some logistical issues of their own. However, Gates did make a good decision, and he decided to place his troops east of the Hudson River, basically to prevent the Brits from crossing the river and getting away. And by October 13th, which, hey, that's my birthday, pretty cool, the Brits had been thoroughly surrounded. Burgoyne and his council met to decide what the best course of action was, and ultimately they decided to open negotiations with the Americans. 4 days later, Burgoyne would surrender his army to Gates under the condition that his men would be paroled and allowed to return to England. Gates accepted these terms. When Burgoyne presented his sword to Gates, Gates took it and then gave it back to Burgoyne. Clearly, there was respect between these two men according to both the American Battlefield Trust and the National Park Service. I wasn't able to verify it with any other sources, so I'm curious where this came from. Some with a little bit more knowledge on the subject, let me know. But they claimed that this was the first ever time that a British army had surrendered. So now the Saratoga Campaign was over. And there were two major successes that accompanied this for the Americans. One was that they prevented the colonies from being split into two. And we saw during our Civil War episode what kind of impact such a split could have on the outcome of a war. And two, when Benjamin Franklin, who was serving as an ambassador in France at the time, when Franklin received word of their success, he was able to use that to help convince King Louis of France to enter a military alliance with America. And obviously, we know how massive getting the French as allies was in order for us to win the war. Huge moment. So I think that's where sort of the turning point of the American Revolution argument comes from. And I think it's a solid argument. I can't sit here and say one way or the other. I still have a soft spot in my heart for some of those battles in the South. I'd say it's between this and the stuff Nathaniel Greene did in the Race to the Dan and Guilford Courthouse and stuff like that. Sort of that 6-month stretch with Daniel Morgan and the Overmountain Men stuff, stuff like that. So, but there's certainly an argument for it. Now, for the Brits, reception across the pond was one of outrage. Faith in the British war effort was starting to waver, actually. One of their politicians, I forgot who it was, he prematurely claimed that the war was about to end because of this. Obviously, it did not. It went on for a couple more years. But the British, they left Fort Ticonderoga, Crown Point, and Lake Chamberlain in the area. And Burgoyne would spend some time living as a guest at Philip Schuyler's house before being allowed to return back to Britain on parole. And he would spend a lot of his time back in Britain defending himself and his actions during the war. Burgoyne's troops, unfortunately, were not as lucky as Burgoyne. Burgoyne at least got to go home pretty soon. For them, they were not allowed to return to England. When Congress found out about what Gates did, the terms of the surrender, they weren't exactly happy with it. So they asked Burgoyne to basically provide info about each soldier so they could keep track of them in case they tried to come back to America for the war. Burgoyne refused this, so all of his men were sent to Virginia to be prisoners of war until the end of the war. 1,300 of these men would end up escaping the POW camp and establish new lives in America. So good for them. Also, about William Howe, he did manage to capture Philadelphia, but would end up retiring from the war effort soon after. And so who would step up, take his place? Well, it was Sir Henry Clinton, who would step up and act as commander-in-chief of the British armies in America. Now, for the Americans, due to being the leading commander during the most successful parts of the Saratoga Campaign, Horatio Gates received the majority of praise from the public and from Congress. I mean, he was the one that received a gold medal. He's the one that's depicted in the most famous painting in history that, is about this campaign, one that's still hanging up in the U.S. Capitol today. He's there smack dab in the middle with his arms outstretched. And anyway, he would soon go on to try and basically usurp George Washington from control of the army, though this was eventually squashed. After he was obliterated at the Battle of Camden in 1780, he was basically done with being in charge of much of anything. Now, last episode, I remarked that Horatio Gates is the Drake of American Revolution era generals. And while I somewhat stick by that because of the memes, and I do think it fits somewhat, I do try to give credit where credit is due. After retiring, Horatio Gates would end up selling his slaves and his plantation for about 800 pounds. But according to the terms of the deal, 5 of those slaves would be free after 5 years, while the rest would be free upon reaching the age of 28. Now, you may be thinking, Drew, that's probably the least he could have done. Obviously, we look back and view slavery as being abhorrent. Would you be right? That isn't much. But it is more than what any other American general of his time did for emancipation. So credit to him for that. However, I'm still not a fan of the guy. But you know who was a bigger hater of Horatio Gates than myself? Well, that'd be Benedict Arnold. Arnold, who remarked at the Battle of Bemis Heights that it would have been better that he was shot in the heart instead of the leg. Well, he would prove himself to be somewhat of a prophet in that regard. After his heroic actions, he received little in respect from his higher-ups or the public at the time. But really, it was only the men who were there at Saratoga. They recognized his bravery, his courage, his leadership. They recognized him as a hero. But beyond that, he didn't get much praise at all. And I understand not getting national recognition when you've done something important, but I mean, I don't understand it. I've never been close to doing anything like that. But you would have hoped that the men on the field serving with him, putting their weight behind him, you would have hoped that that would still mean a lot to him. But Arnold, despite his good qualities, he had a lust for recognition, and ultimately he was willing to sell his soul for it. Now, after the battle, it wasn't all bad. After all, he was given back his rank as being second command under Gates, and was soon appointed military commander of the city of Philadelphia once the Continentals had retaken it. And according to historian John Shea, quote, Washington then made one of the worst decisions of his career, appointing Arnold as military governor of the rich, politically divided city. No one could have been less qualified for the position. Arnold had amply demonstrated his tendency to become embroiled in disputes, as well as his lack of political sense. Above all, he needed tact, patience, and fairness in dealing with a people deeply marked by months of enemy occupation. So soon after getting this, appointment, he started rubbing elbows with people, and he started scheming with the British, and well, you guys know how the rest of that story goes. Benjamin Lincoln, for his part, ended up serving as an interesting contrast to Benedict Arnold, I feel like. Once Arnold's position was reinstated, that meant that Lincoln fell back down the ladder a little bit, and that position put him as the lowest ranked major general, and he felt slighted by this. He was considering leaving, but Washington and others ended up assuring Lincoln of his value to the cause. Like, hey, we love you, dude. This was not a slight, okay? And so he stuck around. Now, he was in charge when Charleston, South Carolina was captured, but he did play a major role in the victory at the Battle of Yorktown. So after the war, he went on to serve as he went on to be a public servant, and generally he was well respected by his peers, although not well remembered by the general public today. In the end, the loyalist Lincoln didn't get any real level of lasting fame. Not many of us know about him today, only those of us that, study the war. He actually has a lot of cities in the South named after him. The cities in the South that are named Lincoln or like Lincolnton, most people assume that's named after Abraham Lincoln, but it's actually named after Benjamin, which kind of further illustrates that point. But Arnold, in contrast, got recognition and lasting fame, or rather infamy, as his name is still synonymous with backstabbers, traitors, and the like. So Arnold got recognition, but for the wrong things, and Lincoln was loyal. And No one really remembers them. I think that's why it's important. If you're going to have morals, integrity, and values and principles, I think it's important to realize that's not always going to pay off with, in the end, like a Disney film, you know? You may not get recognized unless if it's by a couple podcasts in the year 2024. But hey, you stuck to them, and that's important. That's respectable. Arnold, he didn't stick with his principles. So, far from that, I think the biggest takeaway, and this might be a stretch, but I think maybe the biggest takeaway from the Saratoga campaign, given how this two-part series saw such conflict amongst people that were in charge, it seems like those who handled the conflict and trials the best they could ended up winning the campaign. Maybe best they could is not the right wording, but if they were able to work through them, they ended up winning the campaign. Now, for the Americans, you essentially had Gates and Lincoln versus Arnold and Schuyler. But at the end of the day, Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold were able to work together enough to be successful. Meanwhile, John Burgoyne and William Howe couldn't work together at all. They decided to go off and do their own thing separately, and this ultimately spelled disaster for the Brits. And so that was the Saratoga Campaign. Glad to get to do another Revolutionary War episode or two. To be honest, I think I mentioned this in our last one. It's been one of the most fascinating, intriguing wars that I've gotten to study in a long time. You know, growing up, I always used to be fascinated with World War II because, you know, what kid that isn't into military history isn't? But there's so many cool details that I keep finding out about the Revolutionary War. I don't know why I keep being drawn to it. So I'm so very grateful for the opportunity to learn more and to share these cool parts of history with you. Thank you guys for listening. Hope you guys enjoy. Now, for us at the Gun Rack, have fun, stay safe, and we will see you at the range.
Sonoran Desert Institute is an online school accredited by the DEAC. It is headquartered at 1555 West University Drive in Tempe, Arizona. For more information about how you can craft your firearms future, visit sdi.edu.